On a foggy night in late October 1890, a cobbler was walking home after a late shift. Under the dim glow of gas lamps, he saw a small figure slowly pushing a baby carriage down Crossfield Street. The wheels scraped over the wet cobblestones, making a dry, chilling sound. London was accustomed to silent figures wandering through the night. In that carriage, a blood-soaked cloak hastily covered a heavy body instead of a peacefully sleeping child. The next morning, a crowd gathered around the abandoned carriage. A policeman lifted the cloth and saw the face of Phoebe Hogg, a young woman who had died after a violent attack. Not far away, the body of her little daughter was found lifeless. That scene quickly spread across the newspapers, called the most brutal crime of jealousy since the time of Jack the Ripper. But the perpetrator was not some stranger lurking in the dark. Her name was Mary Pearcey. People said she had once been a gentlewoman, raised in a poor family, who lost her father as a teenager. A woman who had tried twice to end her life because she could not bear the loneliness. She loved a man who already had a wife and believed that if she were patient enough, she would eventually be chosen. That evening, when the police burst into the rented house in Kentish Town, Mary was sitting beside an old piano, her trembling fingers brushing the ivory keys. In the kitchen, blood stains still marked the floor, not yet cleaned away. A butcher's knife held strands of Phoebe's blonde hair. When she was let out, Mary simply lifted her head, her empty gaze as if everything had long been decided. Mary Pearcey's case was unusual. Beyond a savage, merciless crime, it stirred public opinion and left a lasting sense of dread. It raised a haunting question in people's minds. What could drive a woman to the brink of such despair, where she was willing to kill both a mother and her child just to cling to a love that would never be hers? There are those who, mad with longing, will do anything to get what they want. Mary Pearcey, whose real name was Mary Eleanor Wheeler, grew up in a working-class family in Victorian London. Her father, James Wheeler, was a diligent laborer who often came home with hands stained in machine oil. Mary's childhood was relatively peaceful until she turned 16. According to some newspapers whose accuracy has not been fully verified, James suffered an accident at the factory, was crushed under an iron mass, and died after 2 days in a coma. His death pushed Mary and her mother into poverty. Even so, the two of them tried to maintain a respectable appearance, hiding their financial struggles behind neat dresses and polite smiles. After the funeral, she and her mother moved to Kentish Town, a shabby neighborhood where widows and the working poor crowded together. In that neighborhood, Mary was considered rather attractive. With her reddish-brown hair, blue eyes, and fairly good height, she blended into the rhythm of the working-class life, quietly living in a rented house. Neighbors saw her as a reserved woman who behaved properly like everyone else. But beneath that calm appearance were the hidden transactions of late 19th century London. Mary entered the familiar relationships of that era. Men provided her with financial support in exchange for her company. In Victorian society, single women without property or family backing were often forced to rely on men to survive. But that same reliance made them targets of scorn and contempt, as if poverty itself were a personal failing. Despite her hardships, Mary cherished a simple but intense dream: to have a husband and a home of her own. She would look up at the women around her. They were proper wives with gleaming wedding rings, respectfully called Madam, and she watched them with a quiet envy. Around 1885, when Mary was just 19, she began living with John Charles in a relationship that was never formalized by marriage, but gave her a rare period of stability. According to records from researchers, John Charles was a manual laborer who may have taken care of Mary while she and her mother struggled after her father's death. This relationship was not only a practical arrangement, but also the first glimmer of hope for Mary that she could rise above poverty and insecurity. Mary chose to take the surname Pearcey from John Charles, a decision that not only helped her navigate harsh Victorian society, but also reflected her longing for recognition. In a world where women were often defined by the man beside them, the name Pearcey became a thin suit of armor. It shielded Mary from judgmental eyes. Although no documents record her words about John Charles, the fact that she kept his surname after their relationship ended suggests it meant more than just habit. Perhaps, as some scholars have suggested, Pearcey was how Mary asserted her identity, even if only in her own eyes, as a woman with her own place, no longer just a shadow passing through other people's lives. As she grew older, Mary came to see that poverty was the source of all her problems. To earn more money, she continued the work of meeting men as she had before. Neighbors whispered behind her back, calling her names that were far from kind. But when the door closed, Mary still arranged her tea set neatly and cleaned her little house. She kept everything in order, as if to prove that her life still retained something that resembled normalcy. Sometimes, while playing the piano alone, she felt the emptiness in the room grow larger than any of the gossip outside. However, the attachment to John Charles did not last. The reason for their separation was not clearly recorded, but it may have been due to financial instability or personal conflicts. When John Charles left, Mary not only lost his support, but also had to face the reality that her dream of a home remained out of reach. This breakup, along with signs of depression and alcohol dependence, paved the way for her relationship with Frank Hogg, where Mary's pent-up emotions and despair would eventually erupt into tragedy. Around the late 1880s, Mary was in her 20s, a beautiful age for a young woman, and she met Frank. When he appeared, Mary felt for the first time that she was being treated as someone who mattered rather than just another passerby. Frank worked as a furniture mover in London. He had a simple but steady appearance. Unlike John Charles, who had only provided temporary support, Frank seemed to awaken, in Mary, a deeper attachment. In letters she sent to Frank, which were quoted in court documents, she wrote, "I only wish to be called your wife, so I no longer feel ashamed." Those words revealed Mary's intense longing, not just for love, but for the social recognition that had long been denied her. However, the relationship with Frank quickly fell apart. At that time, Frank had married Phoebe Hogg, a woman who was pregnant and later gave birth to little Tiggy. Mary knew about this marriage and even encouraged Frank to marry Phoebe when she was pregnant, an action that might have come from the complexity of Mary's own psychology. She believed that if she were patient and gentle enough, one day Frank would leave Phoebe to choose her. But when Phoebe became his legal wife, Mary was pushed into the role of the mistress, a position that made her feel smaller and more insignificant than ever. Sources say she often met Frank at the private house on 2 Priory Street, Kentish Town, where they maintained their secret connection. Neighbors recounted that Mary sometimes appeared affectionate with Frank, but there were also moments when she seemed obsessed with Phoebe's existence. Every time she saw Phoebe with the gleaming wedding ring and the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, Mary felt her heart contract. Mary Pearcey began sinking into long bouts of depression, becoming more withdrawn than ever. She drank frequently to cope with the emptiness in her soul, but alcohol only deepened her sense of unease. Neighbors on Priory Street began to notice strange signs. Mary would sometimes mutter cryptic sentences like, "There will come a time when everything must be set right," in a voice that was both vague and unsettling. Those words revealed a mind growing increasingly disturbed. The obsession with being replaced gradually consumed her. Her relationship with Frank began to fracture when Phoebe gave birth to baby Tiggy. He grew more distant, visiting the house on Priory Street less and less. Their meetings became rushed, as if he were trying to keep his distance. Many people said they saw Frank coming and going from Mary's house with a furtive manner, often avoiding eye contact with those around him. For Mary, Every time Frank left was a reminder that she was only the old lover, a role that felt more fragile than ever. The presence of Phoebe and the little child stood like a wall between Mary and her dream of becoming his wife. The feeling of abandonment magnified her jealousy, making Mary cling even more desperately to the thought that only if Phoebe were gone would she have a chance to claim Frank. The atmosphere around Mary grew increasingly stifling. People began to sense something was not right with her, though no one dared to say it openly. A neighbor, quoted in reports, said that Mary looked at Phoebe with a strange expression when they happened to meet, a look that mixed sorrow with something chaotic, almost like hatred. The calm on Mary's face, which had once been a shield for her feelings, now seemed fragile, as if it were about to shatter. She began to act strangely, as if preparing for something momentous. Mary carefully cleaned the house on Priory Street, wiped every surface, and bought extra kerosene. She wrote a short note inviting Phoebe to tea, but did not share this plan with anyone, not even those closest to her. She also drew the curtain shut, something she rarely did. Night began to fall over the small house, but at that moment, no one could have imagined the horrifying tragedy lurking so close. On October 24th, 1890, the London sky was gray and heavy with dark clouds. Mary Pearcey had risen early, carefully preparing the kitchen and wiping everything down one more time. On the wooden table sat a neatly arranged tea set, next to the letter inviting Phoebe to tea, a letter Mary had pondered for many days before finally deciding to send. As dusk fell, Phoebe Hogg and little Tiggy appeared at her door. No one knows exactly what happened after the door closed. Everything seemed completely normal. Suddenly, neighbors heard screams and sounds of violence coming from the house, but no one intervened, assuming it was a private matter. But very soon, the house fell back into silence. The clock then struck 4 in the afternoon. That evening, a man returning late from work discovered a blood-stained baby carriage near the scene in Hampstead. Nearby lay the body of Phoebe Hogg, showing clear signs of violence. Not far away, little Tiggy had already been dead for some time. The man immediately called the police. They began the investigation as soon as they received the report of the bodies. Police quickly identified the victims as the wife and child of Frank Hogg and started questioning those involved. Frank confessed that Mary Pearcey was his lover, leading the police to search the house at 2 Priory Street. When the police knocked on the door, she opened it with an oddly calm demeanor, as if nothing unusual had happened. According to press reports, she wore a simple dress, her reddish-brown hair tied neatly back, but her blue eyes showed a tension she could not fully hide. During the search, Mary stood still, watching their every move, her hands clenched tightly in front of her stomach. They found many traces indicating that a serious struggle had taken place. Items in the kitchen were scattered, and some dark stains were still visible on the surfaces. On Mary's hand, police found a wedding ring that matched one belonging to the victim, Phoebe. When asked about the blood stains, Mary repeated the strange phrase, "killing mice, killing mice, killing mice," in a trembling voice. Though she tried to maintain her composure, she became panicked when the police discovered the kerosene can and the drawn curtains, signs of an attempt to conceal the crime. According to the investigation files, Mary was accused of attacking Phoebe in the kitchen, then carrying the body outside. Little Tiggy did not survive either, possibly because she feared the child's cries would draw attention from the neighbors. Afterward, Mary placed Phoebe's body in the baby carriage, covered it with a coat, and pushed it through the empty streets to dispose of it. Separating the bodies of the mother and child at different locations was believed to be an effort to mislead the investigation. Although Mary continuously denied everything, the evidence gathered painted a clear picture of what had happened. When she was handcuffed and escorted away, Mary still insisted on her innocence, but her eyes, as described in the newspapers, showed a mix of despair and resignation, as if she already knew her fate had been sealed. In that moment, when the door closed on that afternoon, a tragedy beyond reversal had begun. News of the case quickly spread across London, turning Mary Pearcey into a name that appeared prominently in the press. Public opinion was sharply divided. One side condemned her as a cold-blooded murderer, while the other wondered what could have driven a woman who had always been quiet and withdrawn to commit such a brutal crime. The official investigation began in the final days of October 1890. In her cell, Mary remained difficult to read. She did not confess, nor did she appear surprised to be charged. Reports showed that she often sat motionless for hours, speaking only when questioned, her voice low and firm. A doctor assigned to assess her mental state noted that Mary showed signs of severe depression, but was still deemed fit to stand trial. The trial of Mary Pearcey took place at the Old Bailey Court in early December. The courtroom was packed with curious onlookers, and reporters crowded the aisles. The atmosphere was described as tense, half outraged, half intrigued. The prosecutor presented a solid chain of evidence, from the neighbor's testimony about hearing screams, Mary inviting Phoebe over for tea, to the physical traces found in the kitchen. The motive was intense jealousy because Mary could not accept her role as merely the other woman in Frank's life. The wedding ring on Mary's hand, the dark stains, and her repeated phrase, "killing mice," became haunting details. Throughout the trial, Mary maintained an astonishing calm, consistently insisting on her innocence. According to the press, she answered questions in an even tone, sometimes looking straight at the jury, though her blue eyes revealed a deep unease. When questioned about the blood in the house, she repeated her defense, "killing mice," weakly, causing murmurs in the courtroom. The defense attorney argued that Mary had been driven by prolonged mental distress and despair, that her actions were not the result of cold-blooded cruelty, but of an uncontrollable panic. But that argument did not sway the jury. Outside the Old Bailey, the crowd shouted, calling Mary a monster and a cold-blooded murderess. Women in the gallery whispered about Mary's jealousy, while men debated whether a woman could truly act with such brutality. The case became the focus of the press, with newspapers describing the bloody crime scene in detail and speculating about Mary's psychology, stirring both horror and fascination. When the death sentence was announced on December 23, 1890, the crowd outside cheered, but some people quietly wondered what had driven Mary to such a horrifying act. After 4 days of trial, the jury took less than an hour to reach a verdict. Mary Pearcey was found guilty of 2 counts of murder. When asked if she had anything to say, she simply replied in a low voice that she was innocent. The death sentence was handed down. The press called it one of the most shocking trials of the late 19th century, not only because of the crime itself, but also because of the complex psychological portrait of the defendant. Some articles described Mary as the embodiment of dangerous silence, a woman who hid all her resentments behind a calm face until the very end. As she left the courtroom, Mary was reported to have turned back to look at the crowd one last time. That look, according to one journalist, was utterly empty. When the gates of Newgate Prison closed behind Mary Pearcey, the case left many lingering echoes. Many commentators at the time raised the question, what had turned a woman with a childhood like thousands of other working-class women into a killer? They questioned the role of poverty and the strict moral standards that had forced Mary throughout her youth into such a lowly position. In Victorian society, a woman had only one thing to cling to be loved and to be recognized. And when that last anchor collapsed, all the shame, despair, and the feeling of being abandoned converged into one unforgivable decision. Could a woman pushed to the margins, living in poverty and labeled immoral for not having a husband, be granted any understanding? Or had her brutal crime erased every reason for sympathy? This question left the public at that time both horrified by the cruelty and puzzled by Mary's motives, sparking debates about personal responsibility and social pressure. The case also highlighted how the press of the day exaggerated details to turn Mary into a female monster, both to sell newspapers and to reinforce stereotypes about women who committed crimes. This raised another question. Did society play a part in creating the very monster it condemned? Psychologically, Mary embodied a mind torn between longing and failure. Sources noted her signs of depression and alcoholism, yet no one helped her find a way out. Jealousy, like a quiet flame, drove Mary to the edge of her suffering. Mary's death was later recorded in just a few lines. A cold December morning in the prison yard before a select group of witnesses. The last newspaper mention of her appeared a few days later, and then she faded into oblivion among countless other sensational stories. But if you take a step back, you can see that Mary's crime was the result of years spent on the margins, of a small yearning buried under social pressure and persistent loneliness. Perhaps that is the most haunting part of this story, that the tragedy had been planted long before, back when she was just a young woman sitting quietly by the window in Kentish Town, watching others with their families and their place in the world, telling herself she would never be called the mistress of any home. The story of Mary Pearcey touches the darkest corners of the human psyche and asks whether we can ever truly understand the desperation that leads to such a crime.